what I really wanted to focus on is not just Ibrahim Traore, but like what he represents, especially when it comes to, Africa's control of their raw materials, Africa's ownership of their raw materials, of their natural resources. Because I feel like there's this new renaissance. Look, I can't say it's new. I can't say that. I think there's a renaissance, if you will, happening in Africa concerning economically decolonizing Africa. Africa attempting to own and control its land and its resources, ultimately, in general. Even before the colonial period, Africa has been treated like this sort of warehouse of raw materials that people can just come and extract. When the Mali Empire controlled their natural resource of gold, well, what did we see? We see that Mansa Musa, I don't know if he is now, but Mansa Musa for quite some time was considered what? The wealthiest man, not in African history, the wealthiest man in human history. That says so much about the African continent and what it is and what it could be and what we as Afro-descended people could be in general. In particular, those on the African continent, more so. I would say most of the battle is Africa controlling their resources, owning and controlling their resources. That's more than half of the battle. If we can just do that, if African nations can just focus on that, you have a different story, man, a very different story. About 70 to 80% of some of the energy resources in the world like comes from Africa. Like 70 to 80% of the world's renewable energy, raw materials come from Africa. Like, that's huge. When you look at, say, Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, man, Congo is such a beautiful country. And why is it constantly in conflict? Congo has so many natural resources. Congo is so important to the renewable energy of the planet in general, the raw materials in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Oh my goodness, man. Just imagine for one moment, you had a strong Congolese leader that was just like, we are going to own and control the raw materials that are coming out of our country. And this wealth is going to be distributed throughout the country. Anyway, so here's a quote from Fatih Birol. He's the executive director of the International Energy Agency. So I think he's a Turkish guy. He said Africa is central to the future of global decarbonization and energy security. So he's echoing something that's been said so many different times by so many different people in so many different ways throughout history. This is not the first time an onlooker from outside of Africa saw how important Africa was to the world, saw how important Africa's natural resources are to the world. The Arabs talked about it all the time. Europeans observed it. And that's one of the reasons why I believe Africa was a target. So basically with Ibrahim Traore, I feel like he's in a sense starting this renaissance, this new wave of thought that Africa should really be intent on owning and controlling their resources ultimately. And you see this sort of domino effect on other nations. Now, I don't know if they were always on this tip, but it just seems as though this news is becoming more popular, perhaps due to Ibrahim Traore. But you have Zimbabwe, who's talking about, who's having the same sort of energy, like, hey, we need to control our lithium, pretty much. You have Gabon saying something similar, I believe. Namibia was on that same kind of time. There are several African countries that were saying, like, we need to own and control what we create. So in Zimbabwe, the president, I think this was in 2022, he said, we will no longer be exploited. If you want our lithium, you must build processing plants here. Now look, it's one thing to have all these resources in Africa, and it's another thing to have the infrastructure to extract these resources. And in order to do so, I think many of these nations have to outsource, or at least they feel as though they have to outsource. And that's one of the layers to this, or the caveats, if you will. So, because you hear him say that we're not going to be exploited anymore, but ultimately, if you want these resources, you're going to have to come over here and build. Now, if another nation comes over there and build, like, this ain't going to be no free for all type of thing, like they may want something in return. And what does that really look like, right? Yeah, man. So basically, Africa needs to own and control their resources, man. Like, if we're able to, especially if we're able to build the infrastructure ourselves to be able to extract the resources so it can benefit us, that can be more jobs for, the local African people. I mean, that can be, ultimately, we would have more bargaining power in general on the world stage. There's just so many benefits to Africans actually owning and controlling their own resources. It's just a very obvious fact. Some people, some writers call this period of Ibrahim Traore the resource nationalism renaissance. I don't know if you guys have heard that before. The resource nationalism renaissance, meaning that there are multiple leaders, multiple nations, speaking a little differently about their resources, about their own potential, and investing in themselves, owning and controlling what they create, owning and controlling their resources, and being more competitive ultimately on the world stage. And they're calling it the resource nationalism renaissance, which is very interesting. So I think one of the most salient remarks during this period, when I say period, I'm talking about the resource nationalism renaissance, from what I've heard. It comes from Muasa Faki Mahamat. I think he was the former president, or Musa. Yeah, I think he was the former president of Chad. And what he was saying, he said the era when Africa was content to export raw materials is ending. So ultimately, what am I trying to say? You have Zimbabwe on a completely different kind of time, seemingly. You have Ghana, the president of Ghana, on a different kind of time. You have Ibrahim Traore. You have Namibia. It seems like there are multiple African nations speaking a very similar language. And that language is, we need to invest in ourselves, we need to own and control our natural resources, and we need to be more competitive on the world stage.